In today's video I'm going to be doing something from home today, taking a break from the usual peripatetic forms of content that I've become accustomed to filming on this channel. Now, something that's bothered me for a long time is the idea of overpopulation. Now, my interest in overpopulation was started a few years ago actually. For a long time now, New Zealand has had a housing crisis. This is due to an insufficient supply of housing being built, whilst high rates of immigration has been imported into the country. We just haven't kept up with building houses to match supply. During coronavirus, we closed our borders for a few years, and this allowed time for housing to catch up. But what we didn't see was a house price drop, nor did we see real wages increase. So that started to pique my interest about why we didn't see those supply and demand dynamics start to play out in the market as they should have according to theory. These days I take a completely different view on immigration due to the research that I've done over the past few years. Since then, I've read a good book called The Ultimate Resource by Julian Lincoln Simon, who talks about the benefits of population, and his premise is that people ultimately produce more than they consume in natural resources. Especially on the internet, there's a great deal of pessimism about humanity and what we're doing to the planet. A prime example of this is climate change, but from there are offshoot movements like anti-natalism, which is about people not having children and bringing their kids onto a terrible planet, so they say. It's an absolutely fascinating point of view, considering that life now is the best it's ever been. You could have been born in the 1950s and suffered diseases like polio as a child, or you could have been an adult returning home from World War I and suffering from the Spanish flu. It's absolutely fascinating to get into that mindset, and since I've researched this topic, my views have absolutely formed to be against that kind of logic. Now, it's not just an issue of environment, but also political. Something that was prominent during 2016, especially Trump's campaign, was making America great again. And relating to that was the belief that living standards in the past were much higher than they are presently. So on the left wing you have that whole climate change environmentalist anti-natalism thing, and on the right wing you have populism and economic anxiety and the belief that in the past things were better. Now, I don't mean to be a fence-sitting centrist, but my belief is neither. I believe that today, unlike what you believe and read in the media, is the best time to be alive. This video isn't just about providing some generalized, boring belief perpetuated that today is better because it's just better. I want to provide facts, figures and logic, Ben Shapiro style, and destroy the left wing. This video is going to follow the structure of explaining the past, the present, why things are better, and then that will lead on to why we need more people. The 1950s are glorified as some wonderful utopian time, especially in the United States, with talk of a blossoming middle class who's able to own a home, live on one income, and from that have an awesome lifestyle deriving from that single income. However, that is only if you're a white Protestant male. It's not so great if you're an African American or any other race in America that wasn't treated as well, especially before the 1965 Civil Rights Act was passed. Just think of Indians, Asians, especially Japanese during World War II, as examples of how minorities were treated. You can also think about the homosexual community and treatment of people with mental illnesses, even if they're white. There's also the belief that in the 1950s, living standards were incredibly high, and that the United States had high wages to support the middle class. Now, usually people talk about discretionary items such as televisions, refrigerators, furniture, but the common retort to that is to talk about house prices. But what people fail to realise is that in the 1950s, houses were half the size of what they are now. They have less amenities, they're not insulated, less extras such as ensuite bathrooms or anything like that, heat pumps, air conditioning. Houses today, though they are more expensive in some senses, on a square foot basis, the inflation isn't actually too bad, and considering the other amenities you get, what you're paying for in higher house prices can be offset by lower electricity costs or an improved standard of living. You can live in a cold 1950s house that's uninsulated and has single pane windows, and you can just run your heater all the time. Though the house price might be cheaper, what you're paying in other costs such as electricity to heat your house, or gas for example, you're paying more. Another factor to consider is that the average person was not living in a suburban suburb with a white picket fence. They were still living in slums, especially if you're a minority, or in more dense housing, perhaps living with parents generationally, and that's still assuming that they might live in something decent. Most of them were still living in shacks or something very small and were crowded together. Despite there being more people, the amount of space available to an individual is actually expanding. This has occurred throughout the decades. This speaks to the first logic flaw that Malthusians or people who hate high rates of population will talk about. They assume that having less people means more resources available to them, but what matters is the resources produced and supplied to them in reality. You can have a piece of farmland or minerals that are in the ground, but that doesn't mean that you've got access to them. Higher rate of population allows for access to those resources that wouldn't have been otherwise available to them. If population were to be halved, you wouldn't get double the resources. Supply of those resources would correlate and match the reduction in demand with it. The production of resources is correlated to the demand for it. It's as simple as that. It can be in the ground, can be useless, uninhabited, unused farmland or forest. But if we're not going to use it, then it's not available to you. Another factor that is not discussed is the prominence of unpaid labour. How many people had gardens? How many people had to chop down firewood? How many people had to walk down to a river to wash and clean their clothes, or to even bathe? Because those amenities that we take for granted now were not available 70 years ago. People seem to think that because we've got those amenities available to us now, as a result of the population increase that we've had since the 1950s around the world, that we can maintain that standard of living and just flatline off. What a mistake they are making in that belief. Another myth about the 1950s were that wages were higher, and since then wages have stagnated, especially since the 1970s. But this is once again another falsehood. Wages, by measure of total compensation, according to the Bureau of Labour Statistics, is at the highest rates it's ever been, especially in real terms. There's a lot of talk about inflation, but most of the time it's deflationary to the time that we work. As in CPI, by measure of hours we spend working to fund the things in that basket of goods, is actually reducing relative to the time that we put into it. In reality, we're working less hours, we're making more money, and how far that money goes is only expanding at a rapid pace. People in the 1950s could only dream of having the availability of clothes, toys, food, fuel that we do now, especially for the amount of work that you've got to do to fund it. Back then it was a lot higher than it is now. Fundamentally, the lifestyles of the past, even 70 years ago, were much more different than they are now. The idea that you would have food delivered, or let alone go to a supermarket, is just, especially for your whole amount of food shopping, is just, it doesn't appeal to them because they were still gardening back then. Imagine being able to buy new clothes instead of having to repair clothes. That's an industry that's gone out of fashion. Look at how many people get their shoes fixed. They don't. Even though there's been nominal inflation, once you look at how many hours a person has to work, what they're getting paid for those hours of work, and the cost of goods against those wages that you need to earn, the cost of goods since the 1950s is consistently getting cheaper by measure of how many hours you need to work to be able to afford them. Food, fuel, education, clothing, toys, housing utilities. That's just the facts. All these things are happening in spite of an increasing population, whether it's in the United States, North America, or around the world. The Malthusian argument is supposed to be that more people means less resources per person, and therefore a reduction in the wealth per person that they would be able to enjoy. That is not true. All of these things speaks to the wonders of globalization, outsourcing, immigration, and all those things that we've been able to enjoy. It's a great advantage for us. Being able to enjoy cheaper clothes, food, fuel, etc. is the benefit of comparative advantage in capitalism, and that relates back to the availability of people in the economy. People are so short-sighted that they don't look at history to see how people previously lived, how people used to budget in the past, and their general lifestyles. This leads to the mistake of thinking that today we've got it the hardest and that it's only going to get worse. But in reality, this is the best it's ever been. People are so worried about climate change, but we're in such a good position to reduce our carbon emissions that it's not even going to be a problem in 100 years. In fact, by measure of deaths and victims, the number of people affected by natural disasters is reducing, especially throughout the 20th century. Way less people at the turn of the century died of natural disasters than at the start of the 1900s. All this in spite of population growing. Less people, despite us having more people overall, are dying of pollution-related events, despite climate change becoming a more predominant issue in our news cycle. You just have to look at a photo of New York in the 1960s or 1970s to see the level of air pollution that existed. It's disgusting. It's like how modern China looks today. These days, air pollution in major US cities is not a problem. Another thing about pollution is that less people are dying of water pollution. No longer is sewage and storm water and drinking water all mixed together in the same pipes. Now we have the appropriate segregation of those three things. And the rollout of that plumbing and segregation of those three waters happened whilst population was expanding out into the suburbs. As in, people went out to the suburbs, they built new houses, and since the money was there and population was growing in the overall tax base, the funds were there to take on more debt and general funding to support the creation of that infrastructure. This wouldn't have been possible had population stayed stagnant and people remained in those fixed locations that they'd come from. The main reason is that economically it's just getting more tax out of the same amount of people and redoing what's already there. It's easier to do something that's new than it is to fix. Now, while climate change is a issue, compared to water and air pollution that someone might have been directly affected by or made ill by in the past, it's much more of an abstract concept, and the amount of people that are likely to be affected by it is comparatively much, much smaller despite there being a large overall pool of humans available. Unfortunately, people don't have a good concept of opportunity cost and the best way to save lives and to mitigate and reduce risk. People look at the deaths caused by climate change that are forecast to happen, and they are blindly dead set on that, on reducing those few deaths. But what they're not considering is that what other problems might they cause by focusing on those few deaths and at the expense of other aspects in the economy or society. The mistake people seem to make is that they think they can fixate on these very things and that everything else will remain equal, but it's just not the case. I don't want people to die of climate change, but something that I recognise is that there's also other ways to help people out that might not be currently considered under this current regime. Born Lomberg speaks about this subject, and he speaks about how far can a dollar go when invested socially to help people out. Is focusing on one thing that might cost $10 and saves 10 lives the best way to help people, or spending $1 on something like a vaccine and helping out 1 million people? That's the question at hand. Now, something that we have to consider, and this might make me sound a bit conspiratorial, is that forecasts are usually wrong. They might be right with one set of assumptions, but they're just that, assumptions that nothing else will change. You do have forecasts that talk about different scenarios and they project accordingly, but something that's 100 years out is just so far out that it's hard to ascertain between now and then what might change. So imagine someone in the 1900s trying to predict what 2000 would be like and how inaccurate they would have been. Imagine someone in the 1920s forecasting what the next 30 years would have entailed. They wouldn't have predicted the Great Depression, World War II, and then the economic boom that followed in the 1950s. So many forecasts just end up being wrong. There were a lot of forecasts, especially at the start of coronavirus, about how many people might die, the impacts on the economy, but what ended up happening was that those forecasts never ended up playing out. An example was that here in New Zealand, it was estimated that there was going to be 20% unemployment. Now, there was a slight uptick, very briefly during the lockdowns, but after that we went to full employment, as in below 4% unemployment. People underestimate the impacts that government intervention and technological development will have in changing the outcomes of forecasts. Now, that being said, I actually think it's quite a good thing that we do have problems and that we speak of them and that we do create some alarmism in a sense, because it allows for people to become informed and to investigate solutions. Julian Lincoln Simons spoke of this in his books, saying that problems are good. Problems mean that we can create solutions, overcome them, and become more resilient. Problems make us richer. I don't even need to speak of how many failed forecasts there have been in the past. For example, Club of Rome, that whole MIT study thing about resources and that by 2020 there'd be a massive calamity, and just never ended up playing out. The oil crisis and peak oil, that's a complete myth. If you look at Wikipedia, you can just see how many forecasts have been predicted. With peak oil, there are so many forecasts that are just completely out of tune and out of whack. Some of them are 20 years, 5 years, 20 years, 30 years, 1,000 years. You can see this all for yourself. The idea of peak oil's just been completely debunked. US oil production's just completely spiked back up. There's so many things that point to Malthusian logic, that more people, less resources per person, being completely false. Agricultural yield per person have been increasing. The average space available to an individual has been increasing. The average amount of miles or kilometres driven by a person or a family have been increasing, and they've needed to pay less, put in less hours of work to be able to fund all these things. That does not speak to shortages, but rather to abundance, that population growth that the baby boom has brought us since the 1950s. Now all this relates as to why we do have an underpopulation crisis and not an overpopulation crisis. Currently the Earth has 8 billion people. Now people will scoff at that number and think, my goodness, how can the Earth sustain such a figure? We're soon going to be depleted of all resources, and that from that calamity will ensue. That's the whole Malthusian logic thing. But just think about it, how many people of those 8 billion people are doing something that actually helps advance the Earth in a meaningful way? Now I'm not saying that they're providing absolutely no value, I'm just saying that compared to where they should be, they're not providing the peak value that they'd be able to otherwise potentially provide. How many people with an interest, but they've not been able to fill it because they don't have the education, or they work in a job, or their circumstances just don't allow for it? For example, how many mothers are there that want to become nurses but just can't by virtue of their circumstances? How many people are there interested about space but they're working in warehousing? How many people are interested in computer science but they don't have a computer, for example, or they don't have one at home that they can readily work on? Think about how many people, let alone in the developed world, but in places like Africa or the poorer parts of Asia where perhaps political circumstance doesn't allow them the free expression and creativity to push themselves to the limit. Instead they've got to focus on the here and now. My point here is that though we have all these people, we're not reaching our peak capacity of what we could be producing as people in terms of problem solving. For example, talking about medical innovation, how many people are actually in an engineering sphere or work in healthcare in some kind of way? How many of them don't work in their respective sectors, or they're completely preoccupied by something else? How many people are actually innovative, entrepreneurial, and want to do something to push the boundaries? We're not talking about 8 billion people anymore. We're talking about maybe 1 million tops, but hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands. We're actually talking about very few people, and that's just in one niche. Apply it to every other niche, and you realise that we don't have a sufficient amount of people for problem solving. I can't explain why, but people just have an intrinsic interest in something, and their specialisation and comparative advantage could be utilised. I don't know why people have a specific interest in things or why they pursue interest, whether it's just normal distribution and randomness, or it's something random or chance or probabilities. But either way, more people means that more people will problem solve in those respective niches, and the more people thinking of ideas, the more likely we are to have a strike rate of success in those niches. Reducing the number of people overall means less people thinking of those issues, problem solving, which leads to a reduced strike rate of success and application of their own logic. Imagine the benefits to pharmaceuticals and rare drug research that could be had if we had more people in those fields overall. Now, some people might argue that, well, we can just educate the people that we've got, but fundamentally that still doesn't debunk the issue that a small amount of people do the most amount of pushing forward of innovation. In fact, if you want to be pessimistic and rude and mean, you could make the argument that by reducing the overall pool of humans, though we might be saving lives in some abstract, confusing kind of way in another regard, we're actually going to harm more people by not having those other pool of people available. Even though a few might do bad things and might cause harm, that still does not offset the net gain that the majority of people provide. If you want to solve the whole climate change issue and reduce carbon emissions, the secret is to have more people. Look at Japan, for example. I've recently been there 2 months ago, as one does. If you want to improve infrastructure, you're not going to be able to easily do it with the same amount of taxes from a stagnant wage pool. If you want to improve things, you need to have growth, you need to have expansion, something that's not previously there. It's much harder to replace old infrastructure with the same tax pool and to replace it with something new in the interim, making something very difficult in comparison. This is why having a high birth rate in immigration helps out a lot, because those new entrants, new families, immigrants, they're going to create new houses in suburbs, which requires new infrastructure, and it's easier to build new infrastructure than it is old. And once you get the ball rolling on infrastructure and you get expertise in those respective fields, then you reduce the cost of that infrastructure to roll out in other regards, making replacement of old infrastructure that's inefficient and polluting much cheaper and easier, all without causing any serious economic damage. Another thing is that more people is simply an insurance policy for our species. I don't understand the logic that, we're going to be so greatly affected by climate change that the solution is to reduce our population and concentrate our population. No, we need more people. We need people out in space, we need people in Antarctica, we need people living underground. If you want to guarantee the survival of our great species overall, the best thing is to diversify as much as we can. Ultimately, I believe that we need a reversal on our perspectives of population growth. People produce more than they consume, unless they're Democrats, joking. By pursuing this low birth rate, Malthusian point of view, we're doing a lot of damage to ourselves. We're only going to make it harder to adapt to issues like climate change. We're only going to make it harder to problem solve issues that come after climate change, which they will exist. Again, recommended reading is Julian Lincoln Simon's The Ultimate Resource. It's a massive book, but the perspective change that it's given me about the subject is completely different. Contrary to the mainstream belief, and that perpetuated in social media, I believe things will get better. I believe that we need more people. I believe that the availability of resources available to individuals was only going to improve, not stagnate or reverse. We as a species have a lot to look forward to in reality. We shouldn't live our lives in fear. We shouldn't neuter ourselves. We should do what the boomers did. Now, honestly, I spent the good chunk of an hour or two getting ready and filming this, and I'm starting to get a headache. I need some lunch. I need a Coke. Diet Coke. If you like this video, please like, comment and subscribe.